All right, hello YouTube. Welcome to the Wikilection live stream. This one is on the topic of politics. I hope this goes well. This computer does not seem to like sharing this much, even though there's not that much being shared, so hopefully it goes by without a hitch. Page here. So if this is the first live stream that you're watching, actually I should probably go through the slides here. Intro to the live streams and what we're trying to do here. So the overall goal of the live streams is, of course, to provide information about Wikilection to the people that are watching. And then as well, over time, as we do live streams on the same topic again and again, the end goal is to help us improve the design itself and sort of what we're trying to solve and figure out new features, and then get better at explaining those features as we see questions and as there's feedback. So the idea here is that there's a few different topics that we cycle through, and the basic idea is we present the topic in the current state, we'll answer questions either live or through comments left on the video, messages received, that kind of thing. We'll receive that feedback and adjust accordingly, refine the plans, come up with new screenshots and mockups, that kind of thing. And then the next time that topic comes around, it's reviewed with this new content. That's probably getting into evidence, which we covered in the previous one. So we'll go on to the topic of politics. As we can see here, the following slides show what kind of information will be available for elections, for political parties, and for politicians themselves. So if we're looking at the kind of history that's available for politics, so for politicians and political parties are sort of the two main things that we'd be keeping the history for. For politicians, there's a ton of information. Some of the easier things that that come to mind are keeping track of the promises that they make during campaigns, especially like their main sort of campaign promises, their main campaign platform. And then assuming enough time has passed and they, if they actually won, you can track the outcome. So did they actually do what they promised they were going to do? Track their spending priorities. So that includes both tracking things that they stopped spending money on, things that they cut, as well as things that either were approved or they started to spend on brand new. The history of that politicians, I guess you could say, interaction with legislation. So one of the first steps there is for the Wikilection community to review the legislation involved and figure out what sort of priorities that legislation might show, right? So is it like, for example, more pro-environment and maybe not so good for business? Those kinds of things, to be able to figure out what exactly that legislation, what sort of values it shows, if somebody votes for or against it, what that might hint that person values or prioritizes. Once we have that information, then we can track the legislation that a politician will draft or sponsor or, otherwise actually take part in creating and getting that legislation in front of other politicians to vote. And then once it's ready to vote on, tracking how that politician voted. So that can be, if the person's actually heavily involved in drafting new legislation, we track that. If they aren't that involved in creating the legislation, but they are in a position where they would still vote on it, you can track that as well and just see, the trends and how that person votes over time, right? What are the legislation, did they vote yes or no to? What sort of a theme is there? What common things are there between the legislation that they vote to pass and the legislation that they vote to stop? For the positions that a politician holds where they're able to appoint positions, so some obvious examples are the things like the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of Canada, a lot of times mayors in cities, along with the position that they're running on, they will often, and sometimes it's a requirement, they'll need to appoint people to certain positions. That being a part of their role, that becomes an important thing to track So it's not just who they appointed, but then also what those people did, what their results were. The same kind of results that we're tracking for an elected politician, we track for the appointed ones so that we can, A, see how they did in case they ever run for office in the future. And so we can sort of give some credit for how that person did in their appointed position to the person that appointed them. And then these bottom three, they're definitely important for politicians, but these are also things that would be important information just for experts in general, which if you watch the previous video on evidence and experts, we said that the politicians are also treated as experts because they make claims and they claim to be an expert in certain categories. And so in the case of experts, but especially for politicians, we want to know where their funding comes from. So that can be things like, who gave them money for their campaign. And then as well, if they actually won and they're in office, there's a bunch of other ways that people can get money, whether that's directly. Sometimes they, try to skirt some of the reporting by, I think some examples are them getting money for renovating their house, that kind of thing. And anything that we can track where money comes from a certain source that might skew their interests one way or another, we want to track that. Important events, that's sort of a broad term for that can be important achievements, things that are actually good and that you want to give the person credit for. And then they can also be things that aren't so good, like scandals or crimes, where it's still important, where if this person is running for office, you want to know both the good and the bad about that person's history. And then finally, we want to know their experience, right? So that's sort of like their job history, what skills we can sort of assume they have. And then tied to that, the claims that they've made, either as a politician, possibly while actually running their campaign, but it can also be previous claims they've made while in their previous roles. And then that goes into, again, the previous video talking about experts and the claims they make and sort of using the evidence to verify or disprove some of these statements made. And then the other part that's worth tracking, especially in countries where the political party hold a great deal of power and tend to sort of follow the common themes, like in the US and Canada. We want to track of course, the parties themselves. So in the US, right, that's the Republicans and the Democrats. In Canada, there's the Liberals, the Conservatives, NDP, that kind of thing. So for those different parties, they tend to have a fairly consistent platform across the, sort of no matter who's running. If they're a part of a certain party, you can generally guess they'll have a fairly similar platform to the previous platforms that party has had. That tends to not shift too much over time. We want to know the funding sources of the party, especially if the party is the one that helps fund the politicians run or provides money that way. It's important to know so that you can track where that money comes from. And then also just seeing, because the party platform tends to take precedence over an individual's platform, knowing the funding that's powering that and sort of that might give some extra incentive to steer things one way or another. There's a party leadership. So even if if a person is a part of a party, it's not only important to know what the party does, but also who's in charge of that party. So for example, in Canada, if you have somebody running for the office of a member of parliament, where they're a part of a party, they might have their own platform, but really what's important, since they're a part of a party and there's a party leader that they pretty much have to support, you want to know not only what the party was saying, but also what that party leadership, what their goals were. And then just like with the politicians, we want to know what important events to do with the party. So that might be a party working together to pass important legislation, or getting caught doing, some maybe less than reputable things during an election, that kind of thing. And one of the new things that we're trying out this week on the live stream is to take a look at some of the mock-ups for how some of this information might be presented. So if we look at the timeline for actually, let me expand this a little bit. Look at the timeline for a candidate. This is kind of a pretty rough example, but I'm going to use this arrow here because I don't think this program can pick up my actual mouse. So we're going to do this. So up top, of course, we just see who the person is, what role they either have or are running for. Underneath that, we can see the timeline of what that person has done as far as, you know, sort of their experience and their career goes. So we can see here, this person started off as a teacher, then they did 2 terms on the school board, then they did 2 terms as a city council member, and then they have done 1 term as mayor. Underneath that, you can see these different, the important events that are for that person. And then sort of in between the timeline and the important events, you can see the instances for those events. So if we look at the first one here for the fundraising record, you can see that happened in the 2nd term of the school board. If we look at the event for excessive expenses, you can see the blue sort of arrows up top. They are pointing to, you know, so there was 1 instance in the 1st term as council member, 2 instances in the 2nd term, and so on. You can see the important event for them being a mayor. Now for each one of these events, the idea is that, for example, if we look at excessive expenses, that's the one that's currently selected. All this information underneath is the information that's supporting that claim. So we don't just want people to be able to say anything, you know, good or bad about a candidate. There needs to be evidence to back it up. So in this case, we can see that the important event for excessive expenses that happened while this person was a council member, there's 3 different, in this case, sort of pieces of evidence, which were clips from the local news talking about that story. And if you look at the events themselves, of course, not only does it track where and when that happened, sort of, you know, the actual time, and then what role that person had at the time. There's a brief summary of it. There's a pretty rough attempt at explaining how we might be able to categorize this. So for example, the fundraising record, when they exceeded the fundraising goals by 40%, that made them look good in the area of finances. And then when they received 3 different warnings for excessive expenses as a member of the council, that made them look bad for finances. In the case of the abuse of power here, which I think is the one that's actually shown next, you can see that that one has sort of a question mark for the ethics, and that's because it's only suspected and not confirmed. The goal here is to, you know, because people will likely talk about it, you don't just want to show the things that are confirmed, but things that aren't confirmed, you do want to show that, hey, we aren't 100% sure about this yet, but here's the evidence that we do know in case you hear that claim and want to dig into it yourself. And then you can see underneath it, because now we have abuse of power selected, underneath we have the information for that claim, for that event. There's 3 different clips showing the abuse of power. So that's an example of sort of a combination of showing the person's experience and their, you know, the timeline of their experience, but then also tied together with the important events and where that fits in within their experience. Now, as another piece of, or I guess as another mock-up, this is an example of a piece of evidence that might be used to support different claims. So in this case, this is supposed to be a sort of a member recording of a campaign rally. So we have a fairly typical video player here, right, where it's playing the video that is being talked about. Underneath it, just like you'd probably come to expect, there's the video player with, you know, the timeline showing where you're at in the video. But right underneath that, we start to get into some of the more unique parts. So these colored bars underneath the player where they're numbered 1 through 5, the idea there is that that's something that the member community can do, where as the video is playing, they can tag a certain part of the video. So in this example, you can see it's just started to play the spot where it overlaps with item number 3. And so you can see here in this part of the video, Stephen Connor is making a claim that the traffic is better, right? So if he's running for re-election as mayor, he's making a claim here that, hey, in my time as mayor, the traffic got better. Now, in this case, we're trying to, you know, show some color coding, saying that that's sort of orange. The community has said that's mostly false. And you can see sort of the reason why underneath here. So it's saying, yeah, some improvements were made, but the actual dense areas like the downtown actually got far worse. So it's mostly false, where you can argue, okay, there's some truth there, but overall, it's actually not better. That's not something that this person should be bragging about. Now, not all pieces of information in a video like this can sort of be proven true or false. In some cases, especially with a campaign rally, the person is going to be making promises about what they're going to be doing. So if we look on the right, you can see a list of those 5 claims in the video where number 1, you can see it's sort of a pale orange. And that one was a claim saying crime is down, and the community said that was unrelated, right? So it maybe someone trying to take credit for something that they didn't actually help with. And yeah, it might be true that crime is down, but Stephen Connor here didn't actually do anything good or bad for it. He was, not involved. You can see items 2 and 5 are showing up as campaign promises. So for example, for item number 2 here, there's a promise being made that, if elected, Stephen says he's going to build a new arena. So that hasn't happened yet, of course, so there's no way to prove it true or false. But what we can do is record that it was said, so that if Stephen wins the election and, a year or 2 in, there's no new arena, and Stephen starts to say, well, I never said that, we now have multiple videos of every time he said that at a campaign rally to use as proof. And so this can actually be used to provide evidence for the fact that the claim was made, and then later on, we'll figure out if it actually happens or not, if that campaign promise was fulfilled. So the goal here is to be able to sort of store any kind of media and then just flag if it's true or not, right? We don't want to necessarily hide it because it's untrue. We actually want to use that to prove, hey, here's the things that Stephen said that were true. So for example, you can see here, item number 4 is being shown as being somewhat true, right? It's not 100% true, but maybe there's, the argument can be made that there is some truth there. So he does deserve maybe a bit of credit. Now, with all that information available for politicians and political parties, that gives us a great deal of information to be able to provide more info for elections. So one of the first things that we want to keep in mind for elections is we're tracking the election issues. And when we're tracking those issues, that includes things like ballot measures. So those are things like, Proposition 1, 2, 3 on the ballot that you'd be voting for or against. There's things that are being discussed in the media, right? So at the time that this is being recorded, the US election is in their primary season, and you can see that there's some definite topics that the media is focused on that will come up across multiple channels, even across very different channels. They'll still be talking about a lot of the same things. And then finally, there might be some issues that aren't ballot measures and the media is not talking about, but the community has said these are still important. So the community can also submit their own. And then for each issue, we want to be able to identify those topics, right? So sort of in the previous slide where we talked about being able to flag certain things as, having to do with finances or ethics. Some topics might have to do, with business and job creation or the environment, that sort of thing. And then for each of those issues, not just tracking if it's related to a topic, but then the members can vote on how important that issue is for that topic. So something might be, minorly important for the environment, but has a big impact on business, or vice versa. Now, within the election itself, we want to list all the roles that are being voted on, right? So if we're talking about the US election, of course, they're voting on the president. I think in the primaries season, a lot of local elections will also include, the local politicians, that kind of thing. For all of those roles that are being listed, we want to list what the responsibilities are and what skills are required. And that's meant to give sort of some amount of comparison to what skills they actually have. So for example, if you're going to be in a role that involves crafting legislation, you probably should have some understanding of the law and that, and legislation and how it might affect things when it actually comes into play. For those roles and for the skills that they require and the responsibilities they have, sometimes that will make it clear that a certain election issue might fall onto one person's plate in particular, or it might have nothing to do with that person. So if they start making promises about an election issue that their role has nothing to do with, that's also important to note, right? Somebody's making a promise about spending money and they have no control over how the government spends money. That might be important to know. And then finally, we want to track for each role that we're voting on. If that role can then appoint others, it's important to know what positions those are, what sort of skills and responsibilities those have, so we can start to track, right, not just what does that person do, but what are they responsible for appointing others to do those important roles. And then finally, within each role, there's going to be a number of candidates competing. And for those candidates, we want to be able to know and compare their experience. And this is true for a career politician or somebody who has some history, and being able to compare that to somebody where this might be their first run in politics, but they're going to have some other forms of experience like their careers so far. We want to know what their platform is. So what sort of promises are they making? If elected, I'll do X. Their stances on election issues. That becomes incredibly important for things like ballot measures, where they might actually be responsible for implementing them. But then also, even if it's something that the media has been bringing up or that the community has identified as important, we might want to know where each candidate stands on those issues. And then based on all the information that we know about each candidate, a summary of how accurate their statements usually are. Right. So if we start to see, when this person is talking about a certain topic, maybe, they have a really good track record of being accurate and they have training in it. So it's important to pay attention to what somebody says. Whereas in another area, maybe they're not as honest and not as skilled. So maybe you shouldn't be as concerned about what they have to say about those topics. And then finally, if the person's appointee is known, then you would want to actually identify those whenever possible. That commonly doesn't happen. It's quite common that the person only appoints positions after they've actually won the election. But anything that is known, we want to put here. Again, using the US election as an example, it's fairly uncommon for one of the candidates in the primary to pick a VP candidate sort of until the actual convention. But there is talk about certain people maybe appointing that ahead of time. If they've picked that, then you can actually start to look at that person's skill set and their history and so on. So when we're looking at an election and this type of information, here's a basic idea of how that information might be presented. So we can see here there's sort of two different sides. On the right, we have what the election topics are or the election issues. You can see here there's three listed. So more people care about road maintenance. That's got 37 votes in this case. Campaign finance, where the money comes from that these people are using to run their campaigns. That's a fairly important topic. And then as well, school funding. People are interested in that almost equally with campaign finance. So these are topics that in theory we should see politicians addressing as we dig into the available information. But this allows people to sort of see what kind of topics are available. And on the previous screen where we said it's tied to both what role that person has and what their responsibilities are and what election issues are tied to that role. So for example, the role for city attorney might not have that much input into road maintenance. So if we go and dig into road maintenance, you probably won't see it requesting questions to do with road maintenance from the city attorney candidate, but likely would ask the mayor and council members. So using that to jump over to that spot on the left, we can see that there are three positions being voted on. There's two within the city hall. There's the mayor and the city attorney. There's some information here, right, that there's a four-year term. In the case of the mayor, they administer the city budget, they appoint the city manager, and they appoint department heads. So it gives you like a really high-level summary of what that role involves. And then you can see here some information on who's currently in office, if they're running for re-election, and how many candidates there are. And then it has the same kind of information for each of the roles available. Now let's, as an example, we'll dive into the spot for mayor. And so this is an example of how we might compare candidates competing for the same role. So up top, we have some information about the role. So here we're saying that the position is for mayor, the region is the aptly named Pigtown, and the length is for 4 years. This mock-up was created in 2018. That's why it says 2018. But the basic idea is saying that, hey, this position, you're voting for the mayor for this area for 4 years. And then as well, it's got that summary of, okay, but what does that mean? What kind of responsibilities does the mayor have? It's got a brief write-up, and then you would have some important sort of flags saying, oh, okay, this one, it might be legislative, so it's to do with relating to laws and the making of laws. And so that's where you would say, okay, some amount of knowledge about laws and crafting laws and interpreting them is important for this role. And then as well, this role can appoint up to 7 other roles. And most likely in the actual final application, you'd want some amount of what those roles are, and maybe even some idea for who this person is likely to appoint, other known relationships they have with somebody who might be eligible, that kind of thing. So if we're looking at the actual candidates, they are listed up top. So we've talked about Stephen Connor a couple of times so far. He's the incumbent mayor. So we're going to look at sort of the information for Stephen for all of these different topics on the left. And then there's 2 other candidates. There's Diane and James, and then each one of them has their information listed. On a really large campaign, or on a very competitive campaign where there's a bunch of candidates, there would be some, you might have to cap this at, let's say, 4 or 5 columns, and there's some ability to sort of sort people and move them around. Probably default sorting to show the incumbent, and then people that have similar like tags or values that you as a user have already identified. Now, one of the things here is that we're trying to make it really easy to compare, as the saying goes, apples to apples. So if we're looking at the experience, we want a nice clean sort of grid or table here so that we can just see here's the experience, here's it for each person. So we can see here that Stephen, we can see started as a teacher, school board, council member, mayor. We can see Diane here started as a deputy planner, and then council member. And James here has no political experience, but has been a local business owner, for a number of years. Now for things like the previous term, that's where, this information might only be available for existing politicians, because of course, James here doesn't have a previous term. So when possible, we want to look at the information available for, in this case, how Stephen was doing as mayor. So we see the overall rating of 46%, some sort of a color coding, just so if you're scanning it, you can see, how many good things and how many bad things are there. And then you can see the previous term, the results from campaign promises is a dismal 15%. And then you can see some of the things being listed here where there's transportation improvements. They gave him a 34%. He started but didn't do all that good. New parks, there's a 0% that was abandoned. And then emergency preparation was at 12%. It's been postponed. So odds are they just started it and then pushed it off. And then this was just an example that's not terribly useful to just give the other candidates a chance to trash the incumbent. But that might be like things that they did during that time period. Whatever the community ends up saying is useful in information here. And then we can get into what the person's actually saying about that campaign. So what are their top 3 priorities? If elected, their top 3 priorities, you can see Stephen here saying new arena, more public art, and emergency preparation. You can see Diane says some updates to the LRT, major road improvements, and improved college transit options. And then James has his own as well. Down underneath that, we have campaign contributions. You can start to see the total amount of funds raised. And this is where you definitely want some sort of a high-level summary so that you're not just getting bombarded with information. And that's probably something like, okay, how much have they gotten from businesses? How much have they gotten from actual individual citizens contributing to their campaign? And then how much have they self-funded? For things like the businesses, you probably want to split that out into the different industries so that you can compare that to how they voted and their priorities while in office, to look for any conflicts of interest. And we may also want to, highlight certain ratios. Like here, you can see that Stephen has, more than twice the amount of business contributions than citizens, And Diane here is the opposite. About 3 times more contributions from citizens than businesses. And then James here is mostly self-funded. Now the tags, this is an example where if we look at the previous parts about the events, and you can see here, the excessive expenses event was sort of bad for the person as far as finances go. Their fundraising record was good, but there's more examples of this. And in theory, some people might argue this is worse for finances than the fundraising is good. And so if we go look at this, you can see here that Stephen, has a couple of things. He's got sort of a red warning symbol for finance. We're saying ethics, there's some questionable stuff. We don't have enough information either way, but there is stuff on file that hasn't been disproven. And then there are some positives of, okay, he seems to be involved in charity and the arts, and he's got some government experience. And then Diane here doesn't have as much information available, but again, she's got some experience with urban planning, got some experience with charity, and also had government experience. And then James here, as somebody without experience, but hopefully still some amount of history on file, we know that he's got some experience in finance as a business owner. He's got experience as a business owner, and then experience in, arts and funding the arts, that kind of thing. Some of the other things is, a summary of how they did in their political roles. The end goal here is to just be able to give a high level sort of scan. You can see, don't think the colors are probably coming through too well because this is fairly small, but the goal here is to show sort of a high level percentage of how happy people were with the person's role, and then color coding so that you can just scan here and see, oh, okay, there's 3 orange, there's 1 red, and 1 green. So all in all, not great, sort of, a mediocre performance. If you compare that to Diane, okay, there's 2 that don't have information, there's a green and 2 oranges, so also kind of mediocre. And then underneath, you've got the positions appointed, and that's where it's looking at the individuals that person has appointed, and then their performance. So we can see here that Stephen has, 2 people who he's appointed, the city auditor and the director of IT. The auditor doesn't have a great score, but the IT person actually has been doing a pretty good job. And then with that, you can see she's only appointed 1 person, and that person is doing kind of mediocre as well. And then the last thing here is an example of sort of more treating the election issues as a question for the candidates. And so we said that on that previous election page, one of the main questions was about sort of infrastructure and road work. And the question here is, how would you pay for the necessary road repairs? Now, this is where in an election, ideally, we actually want the candidates to answer directly on the system, because that's sort of the most trustworthy, where, if Diane actually had an account as a politician in Wikilection and saw, the top 5 or 10 questions, then she can go and commit to, here's my position on each of those issues. That's going to be sort of the best outcome. The alternative there is if the person doesn't go and answer themselves, the community can crowdsource the answers saying, hey, here's the 3 or 4 times that Diane has talked about how she would pay for road work. So even if she doesn't come and answer directly, the community can piece together what it seems like the answer would be. Most likely would end up with sort of probably a heavier emphasis on these questions than everything else. And you can start to see where there's no information provided either directly from the candidate, and the community so far hasn't been able to find any information talked about, in interviews, in campaign rallies, that kind of thing. That is, I think, about it for the demos. We talked about the politicians, we talked about the political parties, and then how the information provided for those 2, how they would help support a system to handle all the choices available to somebody during an election. One thing we didn't talk about was on this election page, if there were any ballot measures or propositions up to vote on, they would be shown here as well. And instead of it going to a view like this, it would look at the topic discussion, which will be a future topic, probably the next one, I think, for the live streams. Now that's focusing on being able to sort of analyze controversial scientific topics, so whether that's global warming and vaccines, stuff like that, it would use that same sort of a system to be able to compare sort of the for and against for a ballot measure. Where it's looking at the information available, it's looking at the experts that have chimed in, what their history is, and so on. That is the one thing that we weren't able to get too deep into here, because that's more related to that topic. But I think that is probably good for today on the topic of politics. That hopefully gives you a bit of an idea of the kind of information available, how it's presented, and how the politician and the political party history is heavily tied into the election comparison. As you can see here, Stephen Connor was the example in the previous mock-ups, and the idea being that all that other information would support the summary of the candidate here. And then Diane will have her own information on how she did as the planner, and James might have, some history, probably not as much as Stephen and Diane, because people who have actually held public office will tend to have sort of more information available, because a lot of governments have rules about making that information available. So we'll call it here for today. Thank you for your time, and join us not next week, but the week after, when I believe the topic will be the scientific discussion and sort of how to use evidence to summarize a topic and see if it leans heavily one way or another. And thank you.